So let's go to God in prayer. God, I thank you so much for your great love for us, for your tenderness for us, for your relentless pursuit of a relationship with us. How can we ever thank you for that? Because we are a fickle people who run out of steam, and we get hurt easily, and we blame you. So thank you for relentlessly pursuing us, a relationship with us. We thank you for the stories that reveal your nature to us, and we pray that we might be mindful that this is a revelation of who you are and who we are. And we pray these things in your name. Amen. All right. So the title of today is The Exile, and that's what we're going to be concentrating on. Next week will be the return, and I think that's probably will become more obvious why it might be named that. But let's start off. Significant dates that kind of stand out in our mind, and we instantly all know what that date means, such as 1492. We all know what that is indicative of. Maybe 1607 for some, 1776, 1945, August 16th, 1955. We all know what those dates mean. Is that right? Maybe you're not familiar with, okay, August 16th, 1955 is my birthday. So write that down. Anyway, these are dates that are embedded in our nation's history as key dates that help us in relating to individual stories. Where were you on those days, so to speak? A more modern day is maybe September 11th, maybe 1963, December 1963, November. So the dates 721 BCE and 587 BCE are deeply significant for the people of Israel. First Israel and then Judah was conquered, and the people were led away into exile. The northern tribe, Israel, that happened in 721 BC, and in 587 the southern kingdom fell to the Babylonians. So what was the significance of the exile in the lives of Israel and Judah? And the Bible contains a lot of commentary about this, and observations by those who were seeking to comprehend what this meant. This was not the future. This was not the history they thought this would play out. After all, they were the chosen people. They were their ancestors were the ones who were brought out of Canaan and into Egypt, and then out of Egypt back into Canaan. And so, how did this come about? What happened? And so, a contemporary theological viewpoint finds meaning in these two terms: relinquishing and receiving. The literature of Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Second Isaiah, and I say Second Isaiah is one book, but it really has two parts, and it's seen that way. The first part is really focuses on judgment and focuses on trying to get the people back into an alignment with God. The second part of Isaiah is hope and restoration once the judgment has been sealed and they're led off into exile. So, Second Isaiah, and at the beginning, it was just this collection, a mishmash of oral tradition, people sitting around the campfire handing it down, communities, worshiping communities that handed down the prophecies and all that was spoken about in the past and in the present. And so it was just this big mismatch of different kinds of rhetorical efforts and of varying shapes and various contexts. And it was a disordered mass of material that has been subjected to a very long editorial process. So it started off as just this scattering of written material as well as traditional material as well as practice material. But it eventuated in this long editorial process in a canonical shape of the material as we have it. The books of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and 2nd Isaiah were edited in their final forms in the 6th and 5th century. So that's a while, but it's in exile. You have to understand most of the way the Bible is edited was edited in exile. They had time to do it. So they went back and they were trying to retain their identity, you see. So it was very important that they begin to take in all of these things and begin to make sense of it without it just being left to the individual tribes and the individual around the dinner table. So, and it was canonized. The broader collection of the prophets was canonized in the Jewish tradition, in the Jewish Bible, by approximately 200 BC. 200 BC, we then had the Torah, and we also had the prophets, and we had a lot of that, more of that material. So the intentionality of the order, it's not always clear. We don't know why they put things in order that they did, but we can identify the themes because that's what they went by. It was a thematization of the material. And we can see the themes that emerge from that and what the editors were trying to do, because the editors were also trying to be about the business of relinquishing and receiving, helping the people to let go of what has been in order to receive what was coming. So the literature, as it's now shaped, is intended to help the community of faith do those two crucial things: relinquish what has been and receive what is coming. So in understanding this literature, the date and events of 587 are decisive. Why is that? What about 721, you say? Now, if you remember, 721 was the fall of the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom, do you remember what their religion was like at that time? Under Jerry? The northern kingdom, they had an alternate religion. It wasn't even really Judaism anymore. They were worshiping idols. They had their own priesthood. They had all of this. And so when they were captured by the Assyrians, when they were conquered by the Assyrians, the 10 tribes, called the 10 lost tribes, they were taken and they were scattered over Mesopotamia and over all kinds of places, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. And they were assimilated by the Assyrians into the culture surrounding them, never to emerge as intact, those tribes again. We never hear from them as tribes again. That's why they're called the 10 lost tribes. Unlike maybe about 100 years later, the southern kingdom, which had retained its core of covenant with God, with the temple, but had certainly strayed with idolatry and all of that, but still they had retained the core of Judaism as they knew it, ancient Judaism. They were, when they were sent into exile, they maintained their identity, but it wasn't easy. But they did, and they were able to retain it. So, in understanding literature, the date 587 makes much more. It has much more meaning because they will be the ones who come back and continue with the purpose of God. Now, it's interesting. The year 587 is the occasion when the temple. Remember that grand temple that's built by Solomon and all is burned to the ground. The temple is burned. The holy city of Jerusalem is destroyed. The Davidic dynasty is terminated. There will never be another king who sits on the throne from the line, from the line of David. So the leading citizens are deported. Now, this is important to understand. When later on, if you ever study in depth the prophets, because when they took the people from the southern kingdom into captivity, this is who they took. They took the teachers, they took the arts people, they took the scholars, they took the nobility, they took the wealthy, they took the owners, and you know who they left in Jerusalem? They left the extreme poor, the beggars, the cripples, the insane. You know, that's who they left that's who they left in that city. That is who tended that city until 70 years later or so they were released from captivity, came back. So it's really so as you look at what happened in exile, it will make more sense that this was the upper echelon or the more learned group that was taken into exile. So Judah had two tasks in this crisis of life and faith. It had to let go of the world of kings and temples that they believed God had taken from them. And they had to receive from God's hand a new world, which it did not believe possible, and which was not the one it would have preferred or chosen. So these three poets, and we'll call them poets, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Isaiah, poets and prophets, they showed enormous courage and freedom and imagination as they understood their task at that point was to help those in exile relinquish, let go, and receive so that they could receive a new world. Years and years ago, I have a friend who was she was from Poland, and she was a psychoanalyst. She was a survivor of the Holocaust, and this is many years ago. And she shared with me that in her studies to be a psychoanalyst, they did a research study right after World War II. Because the question was what made the difference between the Jews that survived and the Jews that didn't survive? Was there any corollary, even actions or whatever? After all of this research that they did, this is what they came up with. They came up with those Jews who were willing to accept the new reality that this was really happening. Their survival rate was measured by how fast they accepted that new reality. There were some who never accepted it, who said, the world will not let this happen. Somebody will save us. God will save us. United States will save us. England will save us. They will not let this happen. And she said what they determined was those were the ones who just, because people said, why didn't they rise up? Why didn't all the Jews rise up and fight? Because they could not accept the reality that the world and that God had abandoned them, so to speak. And so the ones that survived were the ones who got it the quickest, who hid their resources, who sent their children off on boats, who got out of the country as fast as possible. And the same thing is happening here. It's the level of their faith depended on them giving up on what was and accepting the new reality. So the historical events that brought about the exile are pretty straightforward. We know why they were exiled. It was because stronger nations conquered them. Stronger nations availed. The reasons and understanding and interpretation of why all that happened isn't quite as apparent. So the readings in this session from Jeremiah and Isaiah and Ezekiel tell the story of the exile. But more importantly, they tell how these prophets who spoke for God interpreted what happened. That's what these sessions are all about. And really mining and understanding the exile is crucial in understanding Israel's past and present and future. So while the destruction of the temple, for many, the culture around them certainly, and for many even in the Jewish culture, for them it suggested that God had lost, that the defeat of Israel's God. And we see this again in the New Testament when the Messiah, the promised one, is hanging on a cross. And all the culture around it, including some within, are saying, you cannot be the God. God doesn't lose. So we see the shadow and substance in this particular event of what is to come, even in the New Testament. So while this is a suggestion that this was the defeat of Israel's God, the prophets interpreted it completely different than that. The prophets affirmed God's sovereignty. They said, no, 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 no. God is in charge of all people. God is in charge of everything, including the Babylonians, who served, they believe, and what they preached to the people. God is using the Babylonians. God used the Assyrians to bring justice to a wayward child, Israel and the northern kingdom. So their take on it was, God is using you because you strayed into idolatry. You stopped believing in the one God, that you were taxing and reigning and ruling with injustice. So the prophets are letting them know this is God is behind all of this. So funnily enough, one would think that this might just in our culture, we probably say, well, if God's going to do that, I'm not going to worship God. That's how we are. If things don't look like the way we like it, sometimes we're like, well, if that's the kind of God, if God is like that God, I'm not going to believe in that God. But in this culture, what it did was it reoriented the people in exile to a more robust and universal monotheism. In fact, it was like a wake-up call for them to come back to the Yahweh God that had made promise to them and was in a relationship with them. So according to Jewish interpretation, the Babylonian exile profoundly transformed the faith of Israel. And it shifted its focus from land and temple, because remember, that was what it was all about. Getting to the promised land, that land belonging to them, and then building a place, a temple in which God would be housed on that land. And so, in a sense, shadow and substance, they were stripped bare of all the things that had diverted their attention from God to what they now worshiped, which was land and temple. So just like back in Exodus, when they had to rely on God in the desert for everything, they now were being stripped bare to rely on God for their future. So it shifted from a land and temple-centric religion to a portable, text-based, community-centered tradition. And what does that look like? Well, if you want to know what that looks like, you can go to any synagogue, any place, on any corner, and you'll see a tradition that started then in the exile and continues even till today. So this period of crisis and displacement, it prompted a deep theological reflection, and it laid the foundation for post-exilic Judaism that still lives today. So the exile had an immense impact on forming and transforming the faith of Israel. And I'm going to talk more about how it was transformed next week when we talk about the return. But I do want to lift up two things to you that I think are important to understand of what happened while they were in exile. The one thing that happened was it was the centrality of the Torah. Before, they relied on priests to interpret, God for them. They relied on, many of the oral traditions. They relied on tradition, that maybe the way their community did something. But here, the Torah, the first 5 books, the absence of the first temple during the exile, it led to a renewed and heightened emphasis on the written law of Moses, the Torah. as a foundation of Jewish life and identity. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, or is there? We'll see next week. So, but at this time, it was what was needed to pull them back and to seal their identity. So, public readings and study of the law, notably led by Ezra, the scribe, and also the prophet, became central to the community's spiritual renewal. We have Ezra up every morning with a morning Bible study, and he's reading the Torah, and he's also interpreting the law. The second thing that I just want to note for you is that we have the emergence of the synagogue. They didn't have synagogues before that. They had to travel to the temple, remember, for their offerings and for God, for the priests to go behind the Holy of Holies and to get the instructions from God. They had to do all of that. But now, with the temple destroyed, local gatherings for prayer and study of Scripture, and this word synagogue in Hebrew just means assembly of people. That's what it means. So the local gatherings emerged as new centers of Jewish community and communal and religious life. So this practice made Judaism, like I said, more portable. It could go anywhere. You know, you don't have to travel for days or months to the temple. You could go to Saul's next door, who was holding, he was holding a prayer meeting, and so it was great. And it continued into the post-exilic period and continues even till today, even though the church synagogues are now more of established synagogues, kind of like our churches started out as house churches, just in houses, and now we certainly meet in buildings. So after the fall of the two kingdoms in the Bible, the exiles lived in a state of cultural and spiritual crisis. Who were they? Who was God to them? What was going to happen to them? And they were forced to build a new life in foreign lands like Babylon while grappling with these new identity and faith. So just to orient you of what happened, the people exiled from the northern kingdom, the ones that were just disseminated, of Israel, they were exiled by the Assyrian Empire to various parts of Assyria, including Mesopotamia and Medes, particularly in the areas of modern-day Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And some of these may have even gone north into other lands. Now, here is an important link for you. There was a group that remained in the region of Samaria, and they were from the northern tribe. So they were the ones who were worshiping the golden calves, had the prostitutes in the cult, had their own feasts and the kings and the taxation and the injustice. They were from the northern kingdom, and then they remained in the region of Samaria. They intermarried with Assyrians and completely forsook their Jewish link. They were eventually known as Samaritans. This is where the Samaritans come from. The northern kingdom, part of that lost tribe, totally assimilated into the Assyrian culture. Now think about that parable, and you see the power of the hatred of the Orthodox Jew for a Samaritan. You can see where that comes from. So these were the lost 10 tribes, and they were totally assimilated cultures, never emerged as cultures again. So when we talk about the return of the Jews to Jerusalem, we're not really talking about the northern tribes who were conquered in 721. We are talking about the southern kingdom of Judah that was conquered in 587. Exiled from the southern kingdom, they were dispersed mainly into Babylon, which is modern-day Iraq. So they were more centralized into one place. But some of them also fled into Egypt and during the conquest, and a significant portion of the population ultimately remained in Mesopotamia, forming communities that persisted for centuries. All right, so now let's come to Jeremiah. What did he have to say to those who were in exile? So Jeremiah was a major prophet in the Hebrew Bible, and he was a prophet along with the others throughout, trying to call them into repentance and all. He was often known as the weeping prophet. I mean, just think about that for a moment. Why was he the weeping prophet more than the other prophets? Well, he lived to see the fall of Babylon. And he was called the weeping prophet because of his anguish over the impending destruction of the kingdom of Judah. He in fact lived about a year. He ministered during the tumultuous period from around 626 to 586. When did it fall? 587. So he saw the fall and spanning the reigns of Judah's last 5 kings, and he lived to witness the Babylonian conquest and the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem. So in Jeremiah 1 through 10, we have the call of Jeremiah. And I just want to lift this up to you because we've talked about Jeremiah at some point. But he had a threefold divine commission. First was to uproot and tear down, preaching against the sin and idolatry of which most of his ministry was all about. The second he had was to destroy and overthrow, declaring God's judgment on nations and kingdoms for their wickedness. But the third mandate he was given as a prophet was to build and to plant. He was supposed to speak of future hope, restoration, and the idea of a new covenant that would come after the period of judgment, that would come for those in exile. So Jeremiah, then we skip all the way from Jeremiah 1 from his call, because a lot of Jeremiah is centered around lament and all the things that he was trying to get them not to do. And so we go to Jeremiah 31, 15 through 34, which is a passage of hope and promise from God to the exiled people of Israel and Judah. And it assures them of future restoration and a new everlasting covenant. And this section begins with the most beautiful poetic lament. It talks about Rachel crying for her children who are lost. Rachel weeping in Ramah for her children who are gone. And this is a symbolic, Rachel is a symbolic mother of Israel. And this lament represents the collective grief of the nation over the loss of their land and their people. So, and so Jeremiah, as we said before, he does this in a poetic form, in a collective form, in a way that touches the heart. But immediately the Lord provides comfort and a promise of hope, because we go on to look at verses 27 through 30. And this is a really important piece. We are coming to some really important stuff right now, because this is a huge, major headline shift in theology. So we come to this short segment, and it says this. It addresses a common proverb of the time. Think about this. The proverb was, "The parents have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge." What does that mean? What does that mean? That means that the children experience the sins of their parents. That means that generationally, the generations are going to have to be held accountable for the sins of the generations before them, passed down over and over again. And God declares in this little section that in the future, this proverb will no longer be true, no longer used. Instead, each person will be responsible for their own sin and will die for their own iniquity, not for the sins of their fathers or mothers. And this highlights this incredibly difficult shift toward individual accountability under the coming new order. And we know that that individual accountability, that really doesn't take root for a very, very, very long time. So verses 31 and 34 is a pivotal part of this passage because it introduces the idea of a new covenant that is distinct from the one made with their ancestors at Mount Sinai, which the people broke over. And in fact, they broke it before Moses could get down the mountain with the covenant. They were already breaking it, dancing around the golden calves. So they kept, and they continuously broke that. With this new covenant, this is so critical because you can see this enormous shift to, you might even be relieved because it's a shift that we maybe understand a little bit better in our modern day culture. This new covenant is characterized by an internal transformation. So, an internalized law. So we read in Jeremiah, God will place his law in the people's inward parts and write it on their hearts. The center of human will, the inward parts, and intellect, the heart. So so this means obedience will come from an internal desire rather than an external compulsion. So rather than being afraid of punishment, God is seeking for the people to desire to do good for good's sake, for God's sake. So this is a major shift. So it's shifting from this punitive outward locus of power over the people, making them fearfully obedient, to a more relational experience of God. So God promises in this particular text, "For I will forgive their iniquity. I will remember their sin no more." God is wiping the slate clean, and he's not even sending rain for 40 days to do it. He's wiping the slate clean for them. So in summary, Jeremiah 31 moves from national lament to this powerful promise of national restoration. And it is a radical new relationship with God, and it's characterized by God being a God of divine forgiveness and internalized law of the heart. This is huge. Does this sound more familiar to you? Is this more a familiar, picture of who God is to you? We've come through a lot of how people picture God. So according to the prophet, and so what did Jeremiah have to do as a prophet of restoration and a prophet of hope? According to the prophet Jeremiah, he gave the people in exile their daily life should involve building houses, planting gardens, and praying for the peace of their new community. So what that tells me is he's saying to them, okay, get a grip, you're going to be here a while. And you're going to make the best of it. And you're going to be good people while you're here. I mean, that's what I hear. That's what I hear saying. That's what I hear him saying. You're going to be people that other people are going to like and they're going to look up to. You're going to make a difference in this society while you're there. And they were there for about 70 years. But they were also instructed to maintain their commitment to God and not, like the northern tribes, compromise their faith, even in the face of assimilation pressures. This period of exile, though it was a time of chastisement for the people's unfaithfulness, also served as a wake-up call, like we said before. The people were waking up to their identity, waking up to the faith of the God that they had served originally. They were waking up to their ancestors' faith again. So it highlighted their need for spiritual regeneration and it paved the way for future prophecies of hope and a renewed covenant. So daily life and spiritual adaptation meant exiles were instructed by the prophet, like I said, to build houses, plant gardens, and in their new Babylonian surroundings, and encouraging them to become a part of the local society and economy without being of them, being with them and not being of them. So that's what they were encouraged. They were encouraged to seek prosperity. They were told to seek the peace and prosperity of their captor cities, as seen in Jeremiah's letters to the exiles. Look out for their best interest. If you've got a talent, use it. To prosper everybody. Focusing on the law. With the temple destroyed, the focus of the worship, like I said, shifted to the law, and particularly we see the dietary requirements became particularly important here, because it became important for them to set themselves apart from the society around them. It was to demonstrate faithfulness and to resist assimilation. And figures like Daniel demonstrated how to faithfully live in exile. If you remember the story of Daniel, the very thing, everybody said, he's so handsome, he's so robust, his skin is glowing. And he's like, well, that's because I don't eat what you eat. I eat what God tells me to eat. So, he had this part of him that he resisted that by the food. So he was one of those figures and those stories that they used to lift up that. Community and prayer. Exiles were encouraged to build a strong community and to pray for their new environment, similar to how they prayed for Jerusalem. So they were not instructed to pray to get out of this place. They were instructed to pray for this place, so that when they left, they would leave it even in a better place than when they found it. So they had a spiritual impact and consequences. The temple of Jerusalem and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed, and it seemed to contradict God's promise of a perpetual kingdom. And the exile also led to a painful but necessary realization of their own sin and unfaithfulness, and which was the ultimate cause of their situation. So what they're trying to say is, for those who said, how could this happen to us? The prophets are saying, well, it happened to you because, you brought this on yourself. You brought it on yourself. Although they were not into, I told you so, they did say, I told you so, and so let's do it differently from here on out. And then, of course, the hope for restoration. The experience of exile was also a time of profound hope. They were in exile, and they were hopeful. I don't even like to think about the poor people back in Jerusalem. They had no leaders, they had no resources, nothing. They were just on the streets scrabbling but the hope for restoration, we had all the leaders, we had all the scholars, we had all the teachers, we had all the entrepreneurs were over here in Babylon, and they were building a society that was closed to the outside cultures, but was restorative to the outside cultures. So Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel provided promises of future restoration and a new covenant written in their hearts. So Ezekiel was a major Hebrew prophet and priest, and unlike a lot of the other prophets, he came from an upper class Judahite upper class, deported to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar II in 597. He was from a high-ranking family of priests, and he lived in a community of exiles by the Kebar Canal in Tel Aviv. In Jewish lore, I think I might have mentioned this to you before, there's a traditional view, because Ezekiel uses that rhetorical device that we talked about last week, of his message is very mystical, very metaphorical, very symbolic. And it was, the prophets used this kind of language, for one, so that the culture couldn't spin it to their own devices, and so that people could also understand it, and it was a way of inspiring people as well. So because it was highly mystical, and the symbolic chapters especially dealing with the divine chariot and heavenly visions, there was an age requirement made of when you could actually study Ezekiel, and there was also some prerequisites. So first of all, you had to be between the ages of 30 and 40. You couldn't be any younger. Those were the ages when rabbis, became rabbis when they were, of a certain age. But they also had to have training in the law so that they could create the parallels between the law and between what Ezekiel is symbolically and metaphorically talking about. And they also had to have a stable personality. I think that's kind of funny. The stable personality means so you don't go woo-woo, and you're just all out there and creating this mystical, other religion. So you had to have required training, be between 30 and 40 years old, and a stable personality before you could even study Ezekiel. But Ezekiel his name actually means God strengthens. And you can actually know a lot about a prophet by what his name means. And it was, so he describes, Ezekiel 1 describes the prophet Ezekiel's calling and commissioning by God. And it starts off, as only Ezekiel can, with this spectacular vision of divine glory and all of that, which we're not going to talk about. But we are going to say that it culminated in his appointment as a watchman for the rebellious people of Israel. He was going to be on watch. So Ezekiel 37 is this wonderful vision of hope. And if you remember, that vision was made into a children's song centuries and centuries later. The hip bone connects to the yeah, it's the vision of the valley of dry bones. This was an incredible vision by Ezekiel, a powerful metaphor for God's promised national and spiritual restoration of Israel from their Babylonian exile. And the passage emphasizes God's supreme power to bring life from death and hope from despair. And what better visualization could you have than the very bones of their ancestors rising up in the valley and dancing with joy? So Ezekiel is a very interesting read if you ever choose to read it. So Isaiah, we know, as we've talked a little bit about Isaiah, was a major biblical prophet, and of course, who ministered in the kingdom of Judah. And the first, portion of his books focuses on judgment against the sin of the people. He was working, just like the other prophets, as hard as he could to change the trajectory that they were on, the path that they were on to destruction. And then it changes into promises of future salvation and restoration through the coming of a Messiah. His name, and I can barely pronounce it, I always get it all boggled up, is Yeshayahu. That's Isaiah. And in Hebrew it means Yahweh is salvation. And it's a fitting name given the central theme of his prophecies. So Isaiah was married to a woman who was known as a prophetess. So it was a family business. And he had at least 2 sons, and the sons' names were Shir Yazhub, which means a remnant will return, which was a prophecy of the coming back to Jerusalem. And the other one, Maher Shalal Hashbaz, spoil, speeds, pray, hastens, prophetic signs. And Isaiah delivered a message of both judgment for social injustice and idolatry, and hope for a future king from the line of David, the Messiah, who would establish God's kingdom of justice and peace on earth. So in Isaiah 40, okay, skip that. I'm going to Isaiah 43. No, I'm going to Isaiah 52. So all that in between is where he talks about a suffering servant. He talks about the one that will come to save and to die for the transgressions of others. The Jewish interpretation of that is Israel itself. that Israel is the culmination of those prophecies. The Christian take on that is that this is a prophecy about the coming of Jesus Christ. And so we, every Christmas, we will read from Isaiah, the prophecies as we see it from that this was the promise of a Messiah. From the viewpoint of the Jews, it is a prophecy about Israel itself. So we end with, after all of this, the cries of repentance, the martyrdom, the shattering of the temple, the burning of Israel, the scattering of all the people, God has remained true. But what about the people in exile? Have they remained true? Now, the big question is, what have they learned as they regroup and make their way back to Jerusalem? Oh, it's so exciting. I can't wait to tell you the ups and downs of our friends who are going to be on the move again. And that will come next week when we come to the return. So many blessings to all of you. I pray that your time together will be fruitful, that you will actually be able to engage in something that's meaningful to you, and that you will have enough wisdom and insight to see God in your midst. So blessings to all of you.